Hello, everybody. I am Patty Dorito, and I am the owner and founder of Holistic Healing Atlanta. At Holistic Healing Atlanta, we don't just treat symptoms, we look for underlying causes where your body may not be functioning well. And trauma is a major cause that the body may not be functioning well. So today's topic is healing trauma and finding God. Trauma can make people feel so alone, damaged, and unworthy. And why do some people grow closer to God while others get angry and blame and pull away from God? And how can we heal the relationship with God and free us from our trauma? So I want to give you the definition of what trauma is exactly. So trauma is the response to a deeply distressing or disturbing event that overwhelms an individual's ability to cope, causes feelings of helplessness, diminishes our sense of self and worth, our ability to feel a full range of emotions and experiences. So we often think of like the war veterans who experience unthinkable things, as well as EMT workers or emergency room doctors. But statistically speaking, the bulk of trauma comes from the home. Trauma can occur if something happens to you or if you witness of something awful. It can impact you and stay with you. So the traumas can be like physical trauma, abuse, physical force. It either can happen to you or you can witness it, say between the parents. Sexual abuse, being forced to do something that you don't want. And with a child, they don't have the right or the ability to stop things. You have emotional abuse and trauma, and that's where a child's self-worth or emotional well-being is damaged. It's like name calling and rejection and shaming and withholding love, belittling. You have spiritual abuse, and that's any attempt to exert power and control over someone using religion or faith. It can happen within a religious organization or just in personal relationships. And then there's neglect, and that's failure to meet a child's basic needs: food, housing, neglect of medical care. So trauma can affect a victim's spirituality, assumptions of life, its meaning, purpose, and significance. When one's spirituality is assaulted or disrupted, then those assumptions about life are shaken and shattered. Ideas of what is good and right and meaningful or worthwhile are questioned. So today I have on the show with us Father Michael Bremer. He was born and raised in a military family and lived most of his life overseas. While attending the University of Georgia, he experienced a profound revelation of God. At that point, he realized his life was being invited to change. After having never considered the priesthood, he was shocked to receive that call. After much prayer and discernment, he was ordained a priest in 2018 and is currently at St. Bridget Catholic Church in Johns Creek, Georgia. So please welcome Father Michael.
Hey, Patty, thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Thank you for being with us again. It's always great to have you.
Thank you. Thank you.
So as a member of the clergy, I'm sure you have seen how trauma can affect a person, both in positive and negative ways. So why should we address the trauma and suffering?
Yeah, excellent question. I really appreciated your little introduction there, right? Trauma has an incredibly broad scope in terms of how it really affects our lives. And so kind of like the way I like to think about it comes from a quote who I'm actually kind of forgetting. But he says, "What is not felt is kept." Meaning I experience something, and if I decide not to feel it, right, if I decide to bottle it up, then I essentially keep it with me. And many of us have the experience of how binding and how constricting that can be. So on one hand, like it's incredibly important to address it because, well, there's a freedom that I'm being invited to. And then so that's the positive side of it. Like this can actually be incredibly life-giving, and I can see the light that comes from it.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because 2 weeks ago I interviewed Caitlin Byrne, and she works at MAR, which is a addiction treatment center. And I asked her, do people even recognize they've been traumatized? She's like, nope. And that's my experience as well. A lot of people don't even see that they've been traumatized. They just like maybe pull away, but they don't know why they've pulled away.
Yeah, because you mentioned neglect there. Because like a lot of times we don't think, oh, neglect isn't necessarily traumatizing, but it can really be. Yeah.
Yeah, nobody loves me. I'm unworthy.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if somebody is traumatized, what do you, as a clergy or a priest, what do you restore first? Do you try to restore the faith in God or faith in the religious community or going to church or something else?
Well, it kind of depends on ultimately where they're coming from. Because like when in the experience of trauma, right, we can vaguely kind of say it's an experience of a reality that makes me feel smaller than this thing, right? So for instance, like when I experience trauma, like the belief is that I'm big, that it's bigger than myself, it's bigger than my existence, right? And that can be incredibly constricting. Ultimately, my approach might be, because like here it's a little bit of a two-pronged approach, because we encounter God certainly in a religious community, but sometimes a religious community can in and of itself be isolating or abusive or whatever, right? So then it might be good to start with finding like positivity with God. So it just kind of depends ultimately where they're coming from. But either way, you need to start off with an environment where I feel safe and I have the ability to be honest about what it is that I've gone through.
Yeah, and trust,
Exactly.
and who wouldn't trust that little face of yours? So after 9/11, 90% of the respondents said they turned to prayer or religion or spiritual feelings. Why did that happen? And then why didn't people sustain that prayer, religion, or spiritual feelings? Why do you think that?
Yeah, so it could be 9/11. It could be some other kind of like where it's just like reality, like as I experience it, is too much for my mind to comprehend, which is true in a lot of ways, especially like just like in its brashness. So it's an incredible human instinct to reach out to something bigger than myself, right? And so naturally, that our instinct for that is God. So I think that's probably like initially and instinctually and intuitively like why people reach out and begin to pray, because that's ultimately the only thing they have to fall back on, right? Again, something bigger than myself. Ultimately, why it doesn't get sustained is because, well, I suppose there could be a lot of different reasons for that. But my thought is that, well, either maybe they've found a way to cope with it, maybe they found a way to process it, and therefore, I might not need God, or maybe even somehow their relationship with God might have been, I don't know, lacking or not necessarily fulfilling, right? So here I've experienced this thing and I'm trying to pray, but nothing's working. So it could be a few different reasons why it didn't necessarily sustain.
Okay, thank you. So people often feel that God is responsible for their trauma and suffering and blame him for it. Why do you think some people get angry at God and separate themselves from the church or the community while others move closer to God?
Mm-hmm. I would like to know the answer to that myself. But I don't know, just kind of like using the context of like therapy, using the context of healing, I think we can sort of get a sense for why it might be one direction versus the other. Because again, like the experience of trauma like helps or makes me believe that my life is frozen at this given moment. And so I hold on to this shame, I hold on to this fear, I hold on to this feeling of isolation. And again, there's an instinct to say, okay, well, there's something bigger than myself, God. But if God is all good, if God is all loving, if God is all powerful, if God is all knowing, then how come He didn't prevent it, right? And so that question in and of itself comes from a place of pain. It comes from a place of knowledge, but more so a place of pain. And so for some people, I think they actually do get an answer to that question, right? All of a sudden, their trauma might have the audacity to say there's actually purpose here, or they might even have the audacity to find that there's actually healing here or something greater than my life, or to make my life even greater than itself. But quite honestly, and there's no judgment or anything like that, some people actually don't find the answer to the purpose of their suffering. And so, again, because there's an all-loving God and He's allowed this, I'm in pain. Therefore, I don't want to have anything to do with that God.
Sure, sure. Um, so trauma and suffering can shatter ideas of what is good and what is bad. And I'm thinking of like a soldier. who kills in the name of freedom. They're commanded to do that. That's their job. Or if somebody is violated by someone who is trusted or loved, how do you help reestablish faith in God and others in these situations?
Yeah, exactly, exactly. There's something to be said about, yeah, just like the brashness of reality, right? So these two examples that you just mentioned, yeah, yeah. So ultimately, it is again what it falls back on is this tension in human reality. So intuitively, right, I know that there's something bigger than myself if I choose to believe in God. That can be both terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. Terrifying because, well, I'm not in control of my life completely, but exhilarating because, hey, there's actually something that can take care of me. Again, I experienced this suffering and I experienced just like the terribleness of this trauma, and it's bigger than myself in some circumstances. So to know that there's a God that's bigger than even my suffering, all of a sudden, wow, that's where the true freedom is being found. So somebody who experiences, yeah, maybe even something like who kill in the name of freedom, right, where there might be such a like discrepancy between what they've done and their conscience. There has to be a space for them to enter into a dialogue, to enter into a type of space with God for them to find no judgment, no shame, in a place where they can truly be themselves and express these things.
Yeah, there's studies that show that when soldiers come back, like 25 to 30% come back with post-traumatic stress. But the sooner that some of these soldiers process the traumas they've experienced and seen, the less likely it's going to get stuck in them. So finding that place. So a lot of that, it could be in particularly in people who have seen and experienced it, fellow soldiers or Marines, whatever, that they can process it. So to get it out of them, to talk about it. I don't know, I don't know if there's any church groups that would also do it because a lot of people don't understand what they lived, so it's just hard.
Yeah,
It's very
exactly.
hard.
I actually remember reading an article one time. It was talking about like the difference between soldiers during World War II and soldiers like in modern day, like Iraq or Afghanistan or something like that. Um, the time it took them to get home is significantly shorter these days, right? You can imagine better technology, better airplanes, and things like that. But they've actually found that post-traumatic stress actually amplified the quicker and quicker like soldiers got home. Why? Because like if they took longer to be on ships, they just had more time to chat with their brothers and process a lot of the stuff going on. So I thought that was a really intriguing
Yeah,
point from this article. Yeah.
yeah, that's good. I know a lot of times when something happens, nobody in the family talks about it.
Right.
There's
Mhm.
secrets, and then it festers and gets bigger in everybody.
Yeah.
So.
Exactly.
So, if God is full of love and mercy, which you've alluded to,
Mhm.
exactly what would you think a trauma person needs? Like, why do they reject this fountain of love and mercy?
Mhm. Yeah. So somebody who experiences a great amount of trauma, like in their lives, um, to be fair, it makes total sense why they decide to reject God. And actually, I say that's a good thing. I say that's a good thing. So kind of like my lens that I look at this reality too is the book of Job. Right, we're all familiar with this story. Here he is; he's living a wonderful, innocent life, like God sees him as righteous. And then all of a sudden, there's a little wager made between God and the devil's advocate. And Job's family, or all his possessions get taken away from him, all his livestock get killed, his house gets destroyed, and all of his children are die. Right, talk about a traumatic experience, right? And so the entire time, his friends are there, and they're kind of giving him trite cliches in terms of like why he's suffering. But again, we kind of get back to this reality. Like most of the time, when I ask a question, there's a deeper kind of thing going on there, and it's my pain, right? And so in the story in the book of Job, Job is maintaining his innocence, right? I'm not suffering because I sinned, right? Or I'm not suffering because of your like he's talking to his friends, like your trite kind of reasons for my suffering. Like I'm a person and I'm suffering. But what's really beautiful about that story is like when you get all the way to Job chapter 38, all of a sudden God finally responds, and how he responds is genius by the author, because you think that God would say, "Oh, well, here's the reason why you're suffering. This." But what does he do? He instead asks Job a bunch of questions. Were you there when I created the world? Were you there when I created the Leviathan and all the water and all the everything, right? And so what Job is experiencing in that moment is, well, there's something bigger than myself. So by these questions that God gives to him, by Job himself is consoled. G.K. Chesterton says, the riddles of God are more satisfying than the answers of men. Because what ultimately Job is looking for in that moment is something bigger than himself, something to take care of him, something to really look upon his suffering with reverence. And so that's ultimately what I think what we're looking for, whether it's a counselor or even in this specific case with God. What we need is for something to know, not only that it's bigger than myself, but also that I'm reverenced, that I'm taken seriously, that I have a place to be honest.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I see people traumatized or suffering, whether it's sickness or something event occurred. They isolate themselves from the world and from God and from like a church community. How do you see a relationship with God and or a community helping to heal a person?
Yeah. So I think I don't know if I pointed out on here before, but it's one of the most ironic things about the human condition is that every single one of us experienced loneliness. To one degree or another, whether it's based on trauma or just like the everydayness of life. But the most ironic thing about that is that I can't actually enter into somebody else's loneliness. So this very thing that we all have in common is the very thing that separates us from one another, except for the power of vulnerability, right? Because whenever I do experience loneliness, whenever I experience suffering, whenever I experience isolation, like that is just my instinct, just to get turned in on myself. One of my most favorite passages in the Bible comes from Genesis 32, and it's the one where God wrestles Jacob, right? And then he changes his name to Israel. I kind of use that as a helpful example for people because when you're processing trauma, you need a space where you know like you're going to be heard. And so there's something beautiful about that image of wrestling. Like here I am wrestling with God. I come to know the boundaries of my own finitude, right? But I also come to know too, just like the glory of his magnificence as well. Um, and so there's something to be said about in God, we have this place where we can actually be angry, where we can be sad, where we can be all this messiness, and he'll still embrace us because of it. So that's why I think relationship with God is of the utmost necessity, because you're a great counselor. And so you hear people's sadness, you hear people's anger, and just by your goodness, you're able to really evoke that out of them to help them process. But even that much more so with God, right? Here's a person I can turn towards, and yeah, and just be messy and allow myself to really process these things.
Yeah, I think the human condition, we all want to love and be loved, feel like we belong. Those are just like built into us as humans. But having empathy towards ourselves and others, that one's a little bit tougher, especially empathy towards ourselves
Mm-hmm.
is really tough for people to, stop like beating themselves up.
Mm-hmm.
I say to people, be curious about what's going on, but don't beat yourself up.
Yeah,
Just be
yeah,
curious.
exactly.
So people often use platitudes such as, this is part of God's bigger plan, or you just need to pray more. That's what some people told me when I was going through my own depression 20 some years ago. So they say these things when somebody's recovering from a trauma, lost one, or an accident. These platitudes have hurt many people, mostly probably unintentionally. How do you help the person not to take personally these insensitive words?
Yeah, I think that's probably just like hitting the nail right on the head. Because a lot of people, when they say that, um, yeah, like they do mean the best, right? Again, like, oh, your suffering has purpose, or like pray about it. Like those things are true, but they can come across really dismissive, right? So what I would tell somebody there is, like, I truly do think that somebody means the best, but I think it probably speaks into this reality that sometimes, like, whenever we share suffering with each other, like, there are no words to describe. Like, all I can really do is just like simply like embrace you or like simply be there with you. And that silence is awkward for people. Right. And so initially, like we do want to say these platitudes, right? We just want to do anything to break the silence because of our own uncomfortability. So I would probably phrase it like in that kind of lens. Like they do mean best, but maybe they're just simply uncomfortable in one way or another. Yeah.
So, what do you think a well wisher can say to somebody who is traumatized and or suffering?
Yeah. So it's going to speak a little bit differently because I know like some people really love to hear like, oh, I'm sorry to hear how you're doing, but other people might find a little bit of guilt because all of a sudden like by me telling you this story, like I've kind of burdened you. So it just kind of depends. Um, yeah, probably something along the lines of that sounds really difficult, or that sounds really frustrating, or that sounds really whatever, use the right adjective to describe their suffering, because there's an acknowledgement going on of what they're going through, and there's also like a message being sent like, hey, I understand you to a certain extent. Be very very freeing for the other person.
Yeah. I think the other really important thing is to let the one who is suffering to know that I'm here, I'm accompanying you. I can't take away your pain, I can't take away that, but I can accompany you on this journey is an important thing as well.
Yeah, for sure. Mm-hmm.
So if a traumatized person is angry at God, how do you get below that to see what's really going on? So it could be depression, loneliness, feeling abandoned, loss of faith. How do you, as a priest, how do you get underneath of some of that? Somebody comes to talk to you.
Mm-hmm. Well, they're always surprised, and this kind of goes back to what I was saying just a second ago. I always tell them, good, be angry at God, because if there's one person who can take it, it's God. So they're always kind of surprised and taken aback by that. But honestly, like, yeah, because like that initial like anger, right, we know is kind of like a defensiveness, right? I want to keep everything at distance. But eventually, like that anger gets exhausted, right? Once the anger kind of dissipates, well, then there's this like deeper stuff like bubbling up from actually within. So I always tell people like, okay, yell at him, right? Do you want to go outside and yell at him right now? And then I offer that to people without judgment and with reverence. Because again, it's getting at this point of like, okay, there's something deeper going on here, but I do need an outlet for my anger. And there's healthy ways to do that, right? Yelling, art, punching bag, right? But so like the anger is totally understandable in a lot of different circumstances. And so once that really dissipates, once that anger has really been expressed, then we can start to get to the deeper things that's really like causing the anger.
Yeah, I love that you say, it is okay, acknowledging and validating it is okay to be angry, because people feel guilty because I shouldn't feel this.
Right. Right.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So if a person has experienced trauma, such as, and I'm just going to give a couple of examples that I deal with, like an abortion or an accident, they often seem to not be able to forgive themselves. Even if they've gone to confession, they've gone to their clergy, they go to therapy. What do you say to help them to forgive themselves?
Yeah. So certainly there's experiences that we have in our life that just have a way of like really clinging to ourselves. Yeah. And no matter like how many like treatments I go through, no matter how many like times I like vocalize these things, they can still have a really, really heavy grasp like on our hearts, right? And so what I'll tell people and really encourage them to do is like really understand like where they were in that moment, right? Because forgiveness always takes place after mercy. Like when I was, whatever, like 15 years old, 20 years old, like what was I really needing like in that moment, right? Like what was I really looking after? And so like when they're able to understand like where they were in the past, it helps them in the present to really let go of that things like, oh, like I was just really looking for love in the wrong place, or I found myself just really confused or fearful or powerless or whatever. That's the reason why I reached out. When they're able to give purpose for the various things that they feel guilty for, well, then there's a sense of freedom that goes along with it. But it's really like the understanding of like, well, what was actually going through my mind and my heart, in the past.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. So how might faith in God be a starting point to help people make meaning out of the trauma?
Yeah. So particularly in regards to that last one, so I mentioned it a few times that there's a necessity of an experience of something bigger than yourself. That's kind of vague, right? But what we were looking for is this reality in particular ways. Meaning, I need an experience of love, or I need an experience of mercy that's greater than anything I've ever experienced. Because like if I experience trauma, there's got to be first of all safety and honesty for me to really start to unravel that. There's even got to be a sense of meaning that kind of gets like saturated inside of like this trauma. And then so God provides, at least for me, and hopefully many other people too, like specifically a place of no judgment. Right here, you have this trauma, right? There's no judgment. I think probably most trauma, they feel guilty for having done it, even though there's like no reason to feel guilty, right? So there's that.
So what about if somebody, maybe the trauma has to do with their dad?
Mm,
So if we say God the Father, do you have an answer for that? Do you, because that male figure is not trustworthy. God the male is not trustworthy.
yeah, yeah, exactly. It kind of depends on where they're at, and I might take it one of two directions. So, because we do recognize, like when we call God Father, or even when we call God God, whatever definition we're using, we have to come to understand that I means something actually infinitely more than anything in my experience. So when I have my Father and I have God the Father, there's an infinite difference between the two. Sometimes that explanation is like in and of itself helpful. It's like, okay, well, I actually can turn to my Heavenly Father. But sometimes there's just such a stark connection between a male figure, even like a woman figure too, right?
Sure.
And so like at that point, there has to be some sort of like mediator, so to speak. So in that case, I might use something like the Holy Spirit, right, the third person of the Trinity, where there's like where it's very very clearly like gender neutral. So it doesn't have like that baggage attached to it, but there certainly is like a presence there, like a sweetness, a gentleness, even like a kindling fire. And sometimes people will find even that helpful.
Great. Great.
Mhm.
So do you see reconciliation or healing services helping a traumatized person to release some of the maybe anger, rage, um, um, revenge, resentment? Do you see that helping?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Because first of all, we kind of started off talking about how like it is how difficult it is to give voice to these different things I've experienced. But like when somebody finally does, oftentimes it's merely internal, right? And so you can probably attest to this. There's something cathartic about like saying these things out loud, right? Like saying these things out loud, like truly do get them off my chest, right? They get them off my back. So that's the reason why, because a lot of people, rightly so, they get indignant at why do I have to go to a priest and tell him my sins? We live in the 21st century. Aren't I perfect? um, but it's like, no, there's something incredibly cathartic about that experience, right? Here's another human being that I'm telling these things to, and hopefully they really do receive no judgment. It's like, okay, thank you for saying that. I really reverence what you've just told me. Um, okay, now it's off your chest. Sometimes it's not, but that's okay. Now it's off your chest, and now there's a sense of freedom in which they can leave. But essentially, like that's ultimately like what we're doing there is like we're creating a space for these things to be voiced, and because they get voiced, they get named, and because they get named, there's a sense of purpose that goes along with it.
Yeah, yeah. It's always very sacred when somebody for the first
Mhm.
time ever says something out loud to me that they've never shared before.
Yeah,
It's like, wow, that's really amazing. And, I have to hold it in my hands very carefully because they just told me
yeah,
something. And I'm sure you hear a lot of that stuff too.
yeah. There's a certain honor to it, right, and a certain like humility. It's like, wow, this person just entrusted to me like something they've been carrying for like 50 years. And
Yeah,
it's like it's difficult to hear, but it's such a I wonder kind of like yeah the image you were saying. It's like yeah, I hold that, I reverence that.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So, kind of wrapping up, do you have any last thoughts to the audience on how to deal with their own trauma or suffering for themselves or those of a loved one?
Yeah, yeah. For me, it always goes back to this honesty. But even before the honesty, there's something that really allows me to be honest. I would call that God's grace or God's presence, right? Where all of a sudden, like, there's a point in my life where I realize, like, wow, I really do need to let this go, right? I need to let this off my chest, right? I need to allow this to be felt, so I can finally shed it. So it's all about that honesty. That there's like such a like the possibility of believing in such a God, where if I do go to God, there's no judgment, right? There's no condemnation. There's no saying I told you so or see or any type of like lording it over. This past weekend in the Catholic Church, we celebrated Divine Mercy Sunday, which and the readings we used were from John chapter 20. Jesus appears to his disciples and he shows them his wounds. Um, in like science fiction, or anytime somebody comes back from the dead, it's because they're there to haunt the people. So like the disciples get really freaked out that Jesus is back in their midst, right after having been resurrected from the dead. And he's showing them his wounds, but he says, "Peace be with you." right? So these very things that they themselves cause become a place of healing, become a place of freedom for them. So there's like really this really beautiful reality where there's an invitation from God to say, hey, approach me with all your burdens, approach me with all your cares, approach me with all your concerns, with all your trauma. And I'm still going to love you anyways. Because when we believe that Jesus Christ, when he died, right, he took upon himself all the trauma, physical, emotional, spiritual, mental, right? And he takes all these things on, but it doesn't keep him, right? It doesn't keep him dead, right? The love of God is the thing that's most powerful. And so when he expresses that reality to them, there they find freedom, there they find peace, right, in his love. So that's probably just like the kind of closing thought, right? Do I have the honesty to approach a God that loves me and that really wants to care for me?
Yeah, that's beautiful. So I just want to thank you, Father Michael, for coming on the show and talking from your experience as a priest, some of the trauma and suffering. So thank you.
Yeah, you're very
Um,
welcome. Thanks for having me.
so, and then to our audience, thanks for listening in. And if you know somebody that may benefit from this Facebook Live, you could pass the link along. If you know someone suffering from trauma, please don't suffer alone. So at Holistic Healing Atlanta, we address the physical, whether it's diet, exercise, de-stressing, sleep. We address the emotional side, what's going on with somebody, and especially trauma. I have a unique, innovative modality that I use called quantum neuro reset therapy, along with neurofeedback. So anyway, and we also address the spiritual as the client wishes. So each person who comes through the door is unique, and so we have a unique protocol for each person. So anyway, I thank you for listening in, and until next time, have a good day.